What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. It is time to recap week number 3 of the 2024 college football season. What a quiet week it was. Not a ton of big upsets happened over the weekend. Yes, we did see one upset that was likely going to happen. That would have been the biggest upset, of course, of the weekend. How about Georgia struggling against Kentucky? I'll talk about that game in just a moment. But overall, it was just a really quiet weekend here in week number 3. We knew this was going to be a quiet weekend just based off of the videos that we did, of course, over the week and everything from last week. From my top 25 video to the playoff predictions, and then also the upset alert video. Again, we didn't really see a ton of upsets this weekend. We did see some group of 5 teams, though, upsetted some power 4 teams. I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. But again, in this video, I'm going to give you my 5 biggest recaps, show you my 5 biggest recaps, from week number 3 of the college football season. So we will start from the bottom and work our way to the top. We'll start with the number 5 biggest recap. Number 5 biggest recap, I just talked about it. Not a lot of upsets this week. This was a really quiet week 3 of college football for 2024. And, I think the reason why it was so quiet was because we didn't have a lot of the top teams play over the weekend. We did see Georgia and Tennessee, 2 top 10 teams, play over the weekend. Tennessee absolutely took care of business against Kent State. Tennessee is looking like a dangerous team just based off of the first 3 weeks of the season. Their defense has looked really good. The offense, of course, has done their job as well. How about Georgia, though? Let's talk about this game. Georgia and Kentucky. This was possibly going to be one of the biggest upsets from last night. Georgia survives by 1 point. And it seems like when Georgia, like I said, gets into these smaller games, they just don't play that well. And that's exactly what happened here against Kentucky. Kentucky really surprised me. Of course, this is a Kentucky team that lost last week to South Carolina. They did not play that well. Maybe Kentucky was overlooking South Carolina and they were focused on Georgia, and they absolutely played much more better than Georgia. Now, Georgia played a lot better in the second half, but they just couldn't be that explosive offense like we've seen, of course, in the first 2 weeks of the season. This was not the same Georgia team that we saw against Clemson a couple weeks ago. So, yeah, it was just a really bad game here for Georgia. I was really impressed with Kentucky's defense, though. Again, they made some big-time stops in this game. And, again, the wide receivers really struggled for Georgia as well. Carson Beck looked really uncomfortable in this game. But, yeah, this was just a really bad game for Georgia. I still think they're the best team in the country. But, like I said, when it comes to, like, these, small games and not these big games, Georgia is really good in these big games. But when it comes to, these not bigger games, they always seem to struggle. And that's been the case with Georgia now for the last, 3 years, it seems like. So, yeah, Georgia's going to have to rebound. They get a bye week this weekend to kind of figure things out, what they did wrong in this game against Kentucky. But the big, recap here is just not a lot of upsets happened this week. Again, we did see some close calls. Like I said, this game right here was pretty much the only call that we had. This was really close to being one of the biggest upsets this weekend of college football of all time. But Kentucky comes up short. They lose 13-12. It was an ugly game, a low-scoring type game. Now, the group of 5 did pull off some upsets, of course, in the Power 4. But, again, I'll talk about that in just a moment. But this is a Georgia team that, will get a bye week this weekend. They'll get ready for Alabama in a couple more weeks. That is going to be a big game. And I feel like when Georgia gets into those big games, they always play really well. And I think that will be the case against Alabama, because Alabama looked really dangerous, of course, over the weekend. I'll talk about Alabama as well just a minute. But that is my number 5 biggest recap. Not a lot of upsets this week. Again, a quiet week here in week number 3 of college football. Moving on to the number 4 biggest recap. Florida State, their playoff hopes are over. I think it's really clear now. Florida State starts 0-3 on the season, and their playoff hopes are already gone, in my opinion. Now, I don't think they'll, I still think they're probably in the ACC championship picture, but they haven't won a conference game. So if they lose a conference game, of course, next weekend, I think their ACC championship hopes are over as well. They'll play California next weekend, and that's obviously going to be a very tough game. California has looked really good in the first, 2 weeks of the season, or I should say in the first 3 weeks of the season. They beat Auburn, of course, this past weekend. So with Cal coming in against Florida State, I think it's going to be really tough here for the Seminoles. You look at this game against Memphis, my thoughts about it. The offense just really could not get things going. The defense just looked awful. And that's the thing about Florida State. The defense has not played really well here in the first 3 weeks of the season. It's really gone back, to the Georgia Tech game, from week number 0, and then obviously the Boston College game. And you look at Florida State in the first 3 games, the teams that they have played, the teams that have been running down their throats, especially on the defensive line. We saw that in the Georgia Tech game in Dublin, Ireland. We saw the game, of course, in Boston College on Labor Day night. So, yeah, both of those teams really ran the football down Florida State's throats on the defensive line. And then you look at the offense for Florida State. It has not been really consistent. DJ Uiagalelei came in with high expectations here for this Florida State offense. But without Jordan Travis in there, I feel like Florida State doesn't really have a good proven quarterback. And that's been the big struggle here this season. The quarterback position has not been really good for Florida State. And overall, this Florida State team has just come in pretty much overrated. I'm not really disrespecting them, but this has just been a rough 3 weeks for them. They're now 0-3. Do we think Mike Norvell is on the hot seat? Probably after these first 3 games, I would say he's on the hot seat. I don't know if I would blame the players or also the coaching staff, but I would probably blame the coaching staff because you're coaching these guys to get a win and everything. But yeah, Florida State has not won a ball game just yet. They're now 0-3. Now, don't get me wrong, they took on a really good Memphis team. Memphis forced some turnovers in this game, and I think that really changed the difference here for Florida State's outcome. But just based off of the first 3 weeks, Florida State's playoff hopes, I think, are over. I don't think they can, I don't know if they'll make it to the ACC championship or not. And I had this Florida State team ranked in my preseason top 25 at number 10. I kind of regret that now, but, it's obviously a Florida State team that's very talented with all the transfers that they had coming in and everything. And this is a very talented team, but it's not really just live up to the expectations here. How about this? Going, from 13-0, winning an ACC championship last year, and then losing your first 3 games of the season. Yeah, I don't think anybody saw this coming, but this is a big recap here. Number 4 recap. Florida State's playoff hopes are over. Let's now move on to number 3. Speaking of Memphis, UNLV, Memphis, and Toledo are playoff contenders. You look at 3 of these group of 5 teams. They pulled off huge upsets, of course, over the Power 4 teams. And it all started with UNLV. UNLV pulling off the big upset over Kansas. I don't think anybody saw that coming. Of course, I didn't see that coming. But you look at this UNLV team, based off of what they've done in the first 3 weeks, they look like a really good group of 5 team out of the Mountain West. This UNLV team beat a Houston team a couple weeks ago. They get a big win over a cupcake opponent from last weekend. And they get a big win here on the road at Kansas. It pretty much happened on Friday, and it was a win, of course, over a Big 12 team. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a really good UNLV team just based off of what I've seen so far in the first 3 weeks of the season. And then Memphis, obviously pulling off a huge win against Florida State. And then you look at Toledo pulling off a big upset over Mississippi State. Toledo, of course, blowing out Mississippi State. I don't think anybody saw that coming either. So, yeah, UNLV, Memphis, and Toledo are playoff contenders just based off of what I've seen over the weekend. UNLV, I think, is probably the best group of 5 team just based off of what I've seen. I wouldn't really count out Boise State either just because of how tough they played Oregon from last weekend. And don't count out Northern Illinois either. These group of 5 teams are playing really, really well. Now, Colorado State did lose, of course, this past weekend to Colorado, so I don't really want to count out Colorado State either. But just based off of what we've seen in the first 3 weeks of the season, these group of 5 teams look like they're ready for the playoff, and that's exactly what I took away from last weekend. The playoff, obviously these group of 5 teams I think are ready for the college football playoff and ready to compete for the playoff as well. And UNLV, Memphis, and Toledo showed that. And, the group of 5 teams are definitely ready for this one. So, again, they are playoff contenders. UNLV, Memphis, and Toledo are playoff contenders. They pulled off huge upsets, of course, over the weekend over Power 4 teams. That is my number 3 biggest recap. Let's now get into the most important recaps here at number 2 and number 1. Starting with number 2, Oregon finally shows how talented they are. Oregon made that very clear over the course of the weekend in a rivalry game against Oregon State. Oregon had to come out really fired up in this one because I feel like, with it being a rivalry game, they got really fired up in this one. Dylan Gabriel played pretty well in this game. The quarterback position looks like it's really going to be good now for the rest of the way. And the offense did their job. This is the kind of Oregon team that I was kind of expecting in the preseason. Be a very explosive offensive team and also be really dangerous on the defensive side of the football. And that's what we finally got. Oregon finally shows how talented they are. Now, you look at the Big Ten over the course of the weekend, we didn't see Ohio State in action. We didn't see Penn State in action. We saw Michigan kind of struggle against Arkansas State. When I look at Michigan, I feel like, Michigan is definitely not going to be a Big Ten championship contender and also still not like a playoff contender either, just based off of what happened to them against Texas. But you look at Indiana. How about Indiana and UCLA? Indiana getting a big win on the road at UCLA. This Indiana team, I think, is very underrated. I think they're also a dark horse team in the Big Ten just based off of that first game for them in the Big Ten Conference. We didn't see USC in action. It was overall a pretty quiet weekend in the Big Ten Conference, but we saw Oregon finally show how talented they are over the weekend, of course, against Oregon State. We saw a lot of rivalry games, of course. This was not the only, former Pac-12 rivalry to go on this weekend. We saw Washington State beat Washington in the Apple Cup 24-19. That was a great game there. And we also saw a lot of other rivalry games. We saw Colorado and Colorado State, West Virginia and Pittsburgh. What a finish to that game. And then we also saw plenty of more rivalries, of course, over the weekend. So, yeah, I feel like we had rivalry weekend. That was pretty much my favorite, thing here about this weekend here in week number 3 was all the rivalry games that played out. And I did watch Oregon versus Oregon State mostly because I kind of wanted to see how Oregon would play against like a really tough team. And that's exactly what they did. They finally showed how talented they are. And if Oregon can keep this up and if the offense can get better and if the defense can communicate pretty well, this Oregon team, I'm telling you, they could be a very dangerous team. I still favor Oregon to go to the Big Ten Championship and also still beat Ohio State in the regular season, but we'll see how the next few weeks go as we head into week number 4 of the season, but we're still talking here about week number 3. But again, this is a big recap here. Number 2 recap. Oregon finally shows how talented they are. Let's now get into the most important recap here of week number 3 of the 2024 college football season. And that number 1 recap, Alabama is still Alabama. I think that they made that very clear, of course, over the weekend with a road win against Wisconsin. So, yeah, Alabama is still Alabama. This looks like the Alabama team that we've seen, of course, over the Nick Saban era. It's not like the same most talented teams and everything, but this is still a very talented roster and a very talented team. And you look at Alabama's performance against Wisconsin, I was very impressed with them. Of course, I called this game yesterday on my live play-by-play broadcast. And Alabama just showed, they just showed us that they are still Alabama. They are still that Alabama team that dominates everyone. But they'll have a bye week this weekend, and they'll have their very first real kind of test, and that'll be their SEC opener against Georgia. But now when I look at that game, I think Alabama's got a shot to pull off an upset just because of how Georgia played, but both of these teams do have a bye week before they play each other, so I think this is going to be a really good matchup. But we're talking about Alabama here's performance against Wisconsin. Jalen Milroe ran the football pretty well in this game. The wide receivers did their job here. Ryan Williams has become one of the biggest freshmen in college football. He had a touchdown reception in this game in the first quarter, and then Alabama, they forced some turnovers. Wisconsin had some fumbling issues. Tyler Van Dyke, of course, goes down with the injury. I think that really set the tone here for Alabama to just dominate the rest of the way. And yeah, this was a tough offense here to stop for Wisconsin. The defense just could not really get it together here for the Badgers, and Alabama just showed us that they could be a very explosive offense. And the defense is going to get better and better. Now, the defense will have their first kind of real test in a couple more weeks when they play, Georgia. But the good news for Alabama is they get that game at home. So if Alabama can pull off a huge upset over Georgia, this Alabama team might be the front runner in the SEC. Now, we saw a lot of great games in the SEC from yesterday. Like I mentioned, Georgia and Kentucky, that was a really close call there for Georgia. And then we had Missouri beat Boston College. Missouri remains undefeated. How about LSU and South Carolina? LSU, letting South Carolina miss a game-winning field goal or a game-tying field goal to force overtime. I was really impressed with South Carolina, how competitive they were in that game, but LSU survives another close game in the SEC. So yeah, this SEC race is looking like it's really wide open as we head into week number 4 of the season. But again, I'm actually really excited for Alabama and Georgia coming up in a couple more weeks. I think that game pretty much decides who could be the most dangerous team heading into the rest of the season, but don't count out Tennessee just yet. I know Tennessee just beat a cupcake team. Don't count out Oklahoma or Texas. Oklahoma, of course, getting a big win over Tulane, and then Texas, of course, took care of business. We saw Quinn Ewers go down with the injury, but Arch Manning stepped up in there, and hopefully Quinn Ewers is not out for the rest of the year, because I think that would be a huge loss for this Texas team. But Arch Manning, I think, can get it done. We'll just have to see how better he can get. But again, we're talking about Alabama here in this recap. Alabama is still Alabama, just based off of what they did to Wisconsin. Again, I was really impressed with Jalen Milroe's performance, not just his running game, but also the passing game. And these wide receivers for Alabama are very dangerous. And this is going to be a really tough, Alabama offense to stop when they play Georgia, of course. And, the Georgia defense is going to have a really tough time against this Alabama offense. We will see how that game is going to go down here in a couple weeks. But that is my number one biggest recap. So not a lot of recaps, of course, throughout week number 3. Again, it was a really quiet weekend here, but we'll see how week 4 is. We got a bunch of games coming up this weekend that are pretty exciting. But that is my 5 biggest recaps here from week number 3 of the 2024 college football season. Let me guys know what you think about these 5 biggest recaps, and also give me your thoughts about week 3 down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned here for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.